Hello everyone, it's Gladius. So we got more information about Diablo IV. Blizzard's been hard at work at sorting through the feedback that they received from the beta and incorporating what they can into the game. Perhaps most importantly, Blizzard did touch on major changes that they're making to the dungeons. There's a lot of stuff to get through, so let's go ahead and get right into it. Before we talk about class balancing changes, let's go ahead and go into the dungeon changes that they mentioned in the article. They released a retrospective on Diablo 4's open beta weekend. They read through the feedback and made some various changes to the game. One of the major changes was the dungeon layout specifically. The optimization of multiple dungeons across all zones minimized the need for backtracking. Quote from them was, "Our primary goal with the layout changes was to reduce certain kinds of backtracking which detract from the player's experience." This was a major complaint in the beta. Players had to go out and grab keys or stones or things to be able to open up, like the boss room, for example, and they had to go back through multiple times, trekking through the dungeon to try to find these items and then bring it back to a pedestal. This was just repetitive content, wasn't really super interesting, and ended up just frustrating for the players. They also mentioned that the chance for an event to spawn inside of a dungeon was increased from 10% to 60%. So more than half the time you are going to be able to find some kind of special event happening inside of the dungeon. And also they're lending a hand to the kill all monsters objective. It was a little bit frustrating for players when they would just be heading through and doing the kill all monsters objective and just to miss one straggling mob behind them, or maybe there was a summoned mob that appeared off the screen and they have to go back through the dungeon and try to find that final monster. They're making it so that these kind of objectives, including the structured objectives, are going to be a lot easier for players to reach, and positioning these objectives specifically along the dungeon pathways to make it easier for players to reach them. Now, the dungeon layouts that specifically changed were these right here, and these are all dungeons that we had access to in the Fractured Peaks zone. Hopefully, these changes will also carry over to the dungeons we haven't yet had access to, because again, we only had access to one zone and one zone type of dungeon. And finishing up the dungeon gameplay changes, they also did reduce things like depositing Animus channel time from 3 to 0 seconds, the time to rescue by half, and these objectives that would take a channel time or some kind of interaction time to complete, they just reduced them by a significant amount to kind of keep the gameplay flowing. I found this update really interesting. They are going to actually generate mini-map pings for when you open up new doors. Something I noticed when I was playing with some of my friends in the beta, that I would get ahead of them and they wouldn't know exactly which direction I went. Having the ping open up on the map, that's going to help them know the general direction that I'm going, and can just kind of give a little bit more to group cohesion. All right, we're moving into classes. So in general, effects like stun and freeze can be applied to elite monsters. And the great thing is that they're going to last twice as long. The effects are going to last twice as long before the elite mob becomes unstoppable. They confirmed that all classes are going to get some kind of stun break or movement impairing effect break, kind of like the Sorcerer's teleport. And they did just a general look over of all the legendary powers and updated some of their effectiveness. This change really stands out to me. The post here is kind of vague about it, so we don't really know exactly what was changed or which ones they targeted specifically, but I imagine we'll hear a lot more about this in the future. Now, when we talk about specific classes, let's start with the Barbarian here. The Barbarian is going to have a 10% passive damage reduction. This is great because the Barbarian was way too squishy, and it did really fit with that class fantasy of being a frontline brawler. Well, you have to turn tail and run when it comes to fighting close quarters with an elite mob. Strangely, at times it felt like my Barbarian was the squishiest character in my party. It's great to see that there's going to be a little bit of compensation to help with the fact that Barbarian is up there in the front lines. This is going to help them just stay alive a little bit better. The Whirlwind skill is now going to consume more fury, but it deals more damage. I'll be interested to see how this one plays out. A lot of players are doing the build that added a passive pull-in when you whirlwind to pull in mobs and CC mobs as they came into your spin. And this one's really interesting. The double swing skill enhancement now is a full fury cost refund when you use it on a stunned or knocked down enemy. That's going to be a great power jump for the double swing skill. And that's going to pair nicely with the increased stun time that we're getting on elite mobs as well. This looks like a great balancing pass for Barbarians. Druids by far were the weakest in the beta and definitely needed a lot of help. So let's see what they did. Companion skills will now deal heavily increased damage. So Druid just looks like they are ramping up the damage in all aspects on the Druid and also making it sure that you can use your ultimate cooldowns more often. Boy, do they need this. These are some great changes for Druid. And then just a visual change at the end. Using a non-shapeshifting skill will transform the Druid back into their human form. Interesting. I'm curious to see if they're going to add a little bit more customization to the Druid. First of all, if you're able to stay in those shapeshifted forms more often. And also if Druids are going to get the ability to customize their animal forms a little bit more than they're able to now. All right, Necromancer. Necromancer was one of the more powerful classes in the beta. And it looks like they're starting off here with making sure that the summoned minions will die more often. On this developer's note over here, they do mention that the reason behind their Necromancer changes was to give more interactive gameplay as opposed to something that felt static and more just you summon it once and then just don't have to really think too much about raising the dead anymore after that. I didn't really see a problem with Necromancers keeping their minions up. In fact, I feel like it's a pretty necessary part. I'll be interested to see how that plays out when we actually get our hands on it. Also, the Book of the Dead has had their stats increased, so we're going to have a little bit more effectiveness from the major class feature of Necromancer. Damage dealt by Corpse Explosion has been reduced. Okay, so there was a huge build with Corpse Explosion and Blood Mist. I think anytime you have a skill that takes a lot of setup, like for example, Corpse Explosion, you need to have a corpse to explode. Also, the monster has to be close enough to the corpse exploding that you're able to do damage to it. I think when you nerf it, especially if you nerf it too much, it will very quickly become completely useless or just unusable. So I hope they go light on that nerf. I don't think Corpse Explosion itself was the broken part of that build. I still feel like that's going to be a strong build even if they reduced the damage. I'll be curious to see how much they reduce it though. And they're toning down the brightness of skeletal warriors and mages. Some Necromancer players were saying that their minions were a little bit too cartoony and bright. It's great to see them responding to this feedback by reducing the brightness of their mobs just a little bit. All right, we're moving on to the Rogue. Looks like upgrades for subterfuge skills have had their bonuses increased. It really looks like all classes are getting just a damage increase. Seems like to be just a flat buff for all classes so far. It's kind of great to see that. Actually, the only class that had something taken away from them was Necromancer. But overall, I felt like the Rogue was in a good spot, and it looks like there's not a whole lot of changes here on the list, kind of reflecting that. Sorcerer was another class that was performing very well in the beta. Let's see what they did. It's another class that got like reining in here. Looks like charge bolt damage is increased, but it's interesting to see the skills that they decided to focus on with the Sorcerer. I know Hydras were the main strong skill that players were using in the beta, and I don't even see Hydras addressed at all here. But having a couple of the tuning knobs adjusted for the Sorcerer's power makes sense, but I hope they didn't go too far with it. The UI adjustments can be summarized just as a couple bugs were fixed, and also they're experimenting more with font choices in the game. They had a couple fixes to encounters, including a reevaluation of the difficulty of the Butcher. I really like the idea of there being dangerous random encounters that you can stumble on, that you have to be kind of on the edge of your seat ready to. Hope they don't tone them down too much though. Now the cellars have some big changes to them. They increase the chance for a dungeon event to occur in the cellars. Often I found myself skipping cellars and not really interested in completing them, but having more of a chance to do events inside of them makes it way more enticing. I guess this goes along with their changes to dungeons, having a chance for events to spawn go up from 10% to 60%. I'd like to see an even higher percent for cellars personally to make them just way more rewarding. Cellars also will now have a chest spawn at the end every time, and then now we can expect to find an elite mob in every one of the cellars as well. They finished it up with a couple of quality of life fixes, including a force to move. This is where a player can set one of their keybinds to be to move only. This helps a lot in events that are more position heavy, where you have to make sure you're standing exactly the right spot. Nothing feels worse than trying to move your character to a certain area, but instead they just cast a fireball in that direction. And a big one here, hardcore players rejoice. Your characters will now be immune and untargetable when loading into areas. This can stop griefing like players pulling a bunch of mobs to the entrance of a dungeon, waiting for players to load out and then die to the mobs while they're on the loading screen. All in all, it's really great to see Blizzard focusing on the feedback and incorporating that feedback so quickly into the game. I feel like they have addressed most of everything that I heard players discussing when the beta was going on and after the beta. Did they miss anything? Was there anything else you were hoping they would address in their beta feedback? Let me know in the comments if they missed anything. What changes were you expecting to see, and how could they go about making that change? If the video helped you out today, please heroic leap on that like button. And if you want to stay tuned for more Diablo 4 content in the future, please bash the subscribe. I appreciate your time, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye, everyone.